as we start out tonight, we are going to give you some more information that we would call introductory information. It's boring unless you look at it in a certain way. Now, I'm going to give you a lot of historical facts tonight. If anybody tries to remember one, I'm going to kick you out of class. Just don't try to remember. I want you to take a look at the overall picture. And it'd be kind of like if I were to tell somebody, I'd say, now let me tell you about the situation in America today. We've got this big political conflict, and now then we've got this financial conflict, and we're over in Iraq, and we're over in Afghanistan, and we're over here. And we're doing this, we're doing that, and here it is, and not over here, and over here, and over here. And we got this problem. What would be your message that you'd get from that? In other words, would I be wanting you to remember all of those things so you can whip them off? Or would it be, hey, we got a lot of problems, you see, that is there. All right, that's really what I want to do tonight as we get into it. We're going to get in the book just as rapidly as we possibly can, but I want to look at it just a little bit more in that way. So now, the book is written by James, which is the Lord's brother, and we've already talked about those things, so we're not going to repeat any of that. But now, here's the reason that I want to give it to you. I want to talk to you a little bit about the Jewish nation and the Jewish culture during the life of James. Because James is going to be talking to these people, and we need to know a little bit about the culture of the nation, about what those people were going through. What kind of problems were they facing, see, at that time? So James, we're going to learn, lived in a turbulent time, in injustices and insecurities and upheavals, and there was just if you'd say, describe the culture in which James and all those Jews were living, why, it was a very turbulent thing. There wasn't any really stability that is in there. Just to give you an illustration, Palestine was filled with corruption during his life. In 33 A.D., Herod and Antipas and Philip ruled different parts of the country. They had kings ruling over 3 different parts. Philip died in 34. Now, remember, the church was started in 33. We don't know exactly when James wrote his book, but somewhere up to, 52, but there's a 20-year period in there. Pilate was banished for his corruption in 36. Pilate was not replaced, and the high priest and the Sanhedrin began to govern. And this is where they then started their corruption in the city of Jerusalem. Now, the Emperor Tiberius, which is over in Rome, he died in 37, and he was replaced by Caligula. Now, the only reason I put that in there, if a nation goes through the death of their emperor or their leaders, does that kind of give a instability to the nation? And if it happens over and over and over again, well, you begin to see, wow, there's a lot of upheaval in there. Now, at this time, this new emperor, he claimed deity. He said, he looked the situation over, and they'd been dickering with this thing. What about the emperor? How great is he? Is he really deity since he's ruler there? And so he then started claiming, yeah, I am God. I am deity. So then he appointed Herod Agrippa, as we all know about him. He died in Acts the 12th chapter. Remember what he died for? That he was there and he took the glory instead of giving it to God. And so God struck him at that time. His son Agrippa ruled just a little bit in there. And then there's another guy that is not mentioned in the Bible, but down there is Cuspis Fadus in 44 to 46. The Romans appointed him as a governor over the land, and then he was replaced in there, and Tiberius Alexander replaced him, and then another guy was elevated to high priest. In other words, if it were going on in America today, this leader getting killed, this leader going to jail, this leader doing this leader being replaced, and on, you could see the upheavals that were in there. Now, there was another guy that came along, and Josephus said that 20,000 Jews were killed in a temple riot. So, in Jerusalem, there was a big riot. 20,000 people killed. Would that make the news if in Seattle tomorrow 20,000 people were killed? You see, all at one time. And so it was a chaotic state that's in there. Now then, this corrupt high priest, and this Ananias, they were both summoned back to Rome. They were so corrupt that the emperor at Rome said, "You come here and you're going to give an account to me for your activities." Well, they went back. They each was accusing the other. Ananias won, and so he returned to be the ruler. And he started his corrupt ruling then. And then Felix was sent, and he started ruling in 57. And under him, the culture and conditions for legalized extortion came in. This is where he tried to extort publicly out of Paul. And now when you're living in a nation that openly extorts their leaders, their rulers, you begin to see corruption is all around them. Now the Jewish nation was hit hard by a famine. We find that in the book of Acts. And Paul one time was taking off, and he went down to Jerusalem. He met with James and Peter. And so they said, "Okay, Paul, we want you to go out among the Gentiles, but please remember the poor." And so in Judea at this time, due to a great big famine, national famine, why people were hungry. And so he said, "Please remember the poor. Try to make up a collection." So he did. Now, it goes on here, and this is where a commentator, it's kind of a long one in there, but you can kind of look at it, and you can begin to see, if you look down there in the middle, it was at this time that there were some zealots, which zealots are people that are zealous for their position. Whether their position is right or wrong, they're zealots. These are the kind of people that we would call the terrorists today, that they just, only one thing in their mind. Well, these people were known as the dagger assassins. And they're even mentioned in the book of Acts. And they would come, they had these daggers, and they would go about town and bing, and they would kill people. And it was just a real mess in there. So just get the picture here, as I'm saying, about the culture. Now, Felix was described by this historian, Tacitus, as one who was wielding in a career of cruelty and lust with the power of a despot and the instinct of a slave. In other words, he was just a ruler, but he had the instinct of a slave, no more culture than that. And so it was a terrible thing. Now, Felix was recalled and replaced by Festus. So we're just back and forth. Now, here it is, kind of getting down to more interesting stuff. You see the corruption of what I'm talking about that's in the nation here. Now, Festus comes in, and Festus was an honorable man. He came in to rule. He was an honorable man. And Festus joined with James the Just. Guess who James the Just was? That's the historians were telling about it. That was the James who wrote the book of James, the brother of Jesus. You remember last week when I told you I looked at James's father, who was Jesus' father, looked at him, and his name was Joseph. And how was he described? How did they describe him? A righteous man, a just man. And I made the point, it seems like father, like son. And so at this time, all the Jews recognized James as a very just man. So now then, the Roman heathen joined with James, the Lord's brother, trying to obtain peace. But they had little effect, and then Festus died. The ruler died right in the middle of it. So then this guy was sent to replace him, and it took 3 months for him to get to Rome, from Rome to get back down. Now during this 3-month period of time, then the Jews were mad at James, and they then charged him with blasphemy, and they murdered James by throwing him off of the temple and then beating him with clubs. So during this absence, James himself actually gets killed. By 66 then, the Romans were tired of these Jewish problems, and they began setting the stage to destroy Jerusalem. Now, we all know about Jerusalem being destroyed in what year? Heard it 100 million times, 70 A.D. But we don't go into this very often, the historical part. That uprising started about 4 years before 70 A.D. And the Romans just got fed up with the Jews, with all of this corruption and Romans trying to help them, and they'd send in a new ruler, and the new ruler would be unjust, and he'd get killed or he'd get called back, and the Jews had uprisings and thousands killed, and men with daggers going along and killing people that opposed them. And finally, the Romans says, we're through with it. We're going to wipe out the Jewish nation. So they came out, and they started up in the north around the Sea of Galilee. And they killed thousands of Jews up there. And down they come, and they get down to Jerusalem, and then they surround Jerusalem. And what did they do to Jerusalem then in 70 A.D.? They just totally eradicated it. It was down there. These are the times that James is going to be writing in. So now, as you look at this book, kind of helps us just a little bit see why he deals with certain things. The book is classified as a general epistle. Now, that's just a man-made term. But if you look at Paul's letters, Paul writes to the Romans, so it's a letter to Rome. He writes to the Ephesians, it's to the Ephesians. But now then, there are some books in the New Testament that are just general. They're written to people in general, not any specific man or church. And this is one of them. But now, I want you to see this. James' book is addressed to the Jews of the dispersion. His readers have a Jewish or Hebrew background, but they're living in a Gentile world. Now, James speaks to them as Christians, but always with a Hebrew culture in mind. It's always with that. Imagine if Jim Butterball came back over here and he settles down here in Monroe. Now, where is Jim's heart? What group of people is Jim thinking about? Filipinos. That's who he's thinking about. Now, suppose he sits down and he writes a letter, a long letter, to the brethren in the Philippines. Would he be writing to Christians? Yeah. But would he be writing with a Filipino background? In other words, he would be using some of their terminology. He would refer to some of their laws, and he would refer to them in that way. So, if I were to write a letter to you, I would be writing from an American background. Jim writes, you're going to pick up Filipino stuff in there. Now, James is writing to the Jews. He's writing to a group of Jews that are unique. They're not just the normal Jews that's living around Jerusalem, but they're the ones that's scattered out throughout the world. So we need to understand that he's writing to Christians who are Jews. So you'll see a Jewish tint in the letter. That's what I mean. You'll kind of see that as you get there. Now, his letter is going to deal with practical, everyday living, common sense Christianity. As he's writing to these people that are living out in the world, these Jews, these friends of his, they love him, he loves them, and he's writing to them. He's not going to be writing and developing a theme. He's going to be writing to tell them, here's how you live in this chaotic time. Here's how you live at this particular period of time. Now, as you would look at it, look at your Bibles, we'd say, well, Paul was a preacher, faith. That word just shines out. Peter, hope. That word just shines out. John, love, just shines out. Thank you. But James, he was a preacher of righteousness, godly living. That's what the book is going to be about. That's it. Here is the way you live every day of your life. It's that godly living that is there. Now, if you look at it, here's what we're going to find in the book. Now, the book really can't be outlined. It's not a book that takes a section and then another section, but he'll deal maybe one verse telling him this, the next verse, something else, next verse, something else. But in every verse, it's always, here's how you behave. That's what we find in here. So now, he was writing to the Jews who were being persecuted by their wicked, rich Jewish rulers in Jerusalem. He exhorts them to endure persecution and tells them it will help them. He said, don't you blame God when these things come upon you, and make sure that you always examine yourself. He tells them now, pure religion and undefiled before God is what you do. It's how you take care of the widows and the orphans. Now, don't you show partiality to the rich, because the rich has power over you. And then he shows now, your works really matter. You've got to stay pure. You got to do what's right. You have to watch your tongue. Don't start judging your brethren. Don't think you can know the future. Pay your debts. Be patient. Don't murmur against each other. And then you can use Job for an example. Don't forget Job in his persecution. So the idea is always do what is right. Always do what is right. Always, and you can finish it out. That's what the book of James is really going to be telling us about. Now, the death of James. It's revealed to us here by this historian. Josephus tells us about this, how that the Jewish people got mad at James and the ruler was gone, and finally they took James up on the pinnacle of the temple and threw him off, and then came in with clubs and beat him to death. Now, if you look at that corner that's facing you, there is the pinnacle of the temple. There's where they took James and put him up on that. Now, they're getting ready to throw him off, and as they throw him off, he's going to fall down there and all of that stuff, and they're going to rush in with clubs, and they're going to beat him to death. So that's how James finally ended up dying. Now, the lessons we've learned in our introduction real quickly. We've learned about James himself, about his family, his relationship with Jesus, about his childhood, where he lived up in Nazareth, mountainous country, about his Jewish readers out in the dispersion, about the Jewish nation, the culture in which he lived, the purpose of his book, about his life as a Christian. He was a very zealous person and a pillar of the church in Jerusalem. We've learned about his death, and now we can begin the study of the book of James. And remember, the study is practical Christianity. So that's what it's all going to be about. So now let's go to the salutation. Every book has a salutation. Today, our salutation is like this. If I'm going to write a letter, I'd say, Dear John, dot, 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 dot. I'd write the letter, and then down at the end, I'd say, yours truly, sincerely, or whatever I want to say, and then I'd sign it, Lowell. The first half of the salutation is up at the beginning, last is down there. The way they wrote salutation, they wrote it at the very beginning. And so it would be like if I were going to write a letter to John today, I would say, I, Lowell, to John. Now, I can put other things with it if I want to. I can say, I, Lowell, a member of the Monroe Church, to John, a very faithful Christian who lives somewhere. But that's the salutation. Now, it's kind of interesting when you look at the salutation here of how he addresses his readers. He starts out and he says, James. That's all he identifies himself by. So oftentimes, Paul would always write, he would say, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ. See? And he would identify himself and the authority by which he wrote. James just says James. Now this letter is to be set out throughout the Gentile world, which tells you that he was pretty well known, wasn't he? See, pretty well known. When you can just use your given name, send it out, and you expect people to understand who it is. Then he says, a servant of God. Not the brother of Christ, but a servant of God. Now, that word for servant means a slave or a bondservant. It was the most lowly kind of a servant, and it was a unique relationship in New Testament times. Might talk about that for just a moment. We don't have anything like that in America now. Even back in our days of slavery, this would be the word they would use. Now, today we have, you could say, well, okay, we have two kinds of servants. You have a servant where they hire, let's say, a nanny, somebody to move in. And you move in my house, and you take care of my house. You're my servant. Today I want you to do this. Tomorrow I want you to do that. You're a servant. We never think of that as slavery, do we? Okay? That's not slavery, because that's all willing relationship. It's just, that's what we'd kind of say an employer and employee relationship. Now, there's another kind of servant, and that's where we had servants in the South, slaves that we call them. Now, when you look at that, a slave is somebody who is serving unwillingly. They're bought and sold. They don't have any choice, and so they're serving unwillingly. Now, slaves in the New Testament, kind of right in between there. And that is that I could go out and I could buy a slave. But when I bought a slave, I had power over that slave. I'm his master. I could kill him if I wanted to. If he rebels and so forth, I could kill him. But it's more of a relationship of where, okay, I will serve you, and I, your master, I will treat you with kindness. And with most servants, just to give you an illustration, when rich people had servants, many of their servants or their slaves were doctors, and they were accountants. And they would put them over their business and keeping their books, or it would be their personal physician. And many slaves, I'd buy me a slave, and then that slave knows that if he serves me faithfully, one of these days, I'll give him his freedom. I'll give him his freedom. And so slaves at that time, they had a different relationship. They could be put to death. They had a bad one. But it wasn't like the slave that we had here in the South, you see. And then here's the other unique thing. The term slave in New Testament times oftentimes carried with it the idea of dignity. For instance, if I told you that today President Bush appointed Dr. Jones as his personal physician, okay? Thank you, Rod. As his personal physician, would you feel sorry for Dr. Jones? Or would you say Dr. Jones has a pretty good deal going for him? He's the personal physician of the president. In those days, that would be what it is. So, Dr. Jones today, he would go out and introduce himself. I'm Dr. Jones. I'm the physician for President Bush. Prestige? Yeah. So slaves in New Testament times had that. It was an honor they had attached to the master that they had. Now I want you to think about it in this way. When a Christian would talk about a slave, being a slave of Jesus Christ, they were talking about someone that was totally attached to Jesus Christ. They totally belonged to Jesus Christ. But was it a title to where they could have dignity attached to it? Yeah. I'm a slave of Jesus Christ. I'm his slave, and they wouldn't think of it like we would think of a slave 100, 200 years ago. Think about it. He has this good relationship with his master. So I just throw that in, kind of interesting in there. But he says he's a servant of Jesus Christ there. Now, this humility, I think that I would have had the tendency to say, I, James, a brother of Jesus Christ. Anybody in here, could you have resisted that temptation and just put in a slave of Jesus Christ? I think it tells us a little bit about the character of James. By the way, Jude does the same thing. Now, Jude is also a brother of Jesus Christ. James and Jude, they were the two brothers of Jesus. They wrote books, and they're the two men that left their office of dignity out and just called them a slave there of Jesus Christ. So that's kind of interesting. When you look back and you think about the brothers of Jesus Christ, remember, when was it that they started becoming a believer? It was only after the resurrection, see? But they became a believer, and now then that's the way they address themselves. He said to the 12 tribes, that's to the Jewish. He's going to be addressing these things to the Jews. And then he says to the dispersion. Now the word dispersion just literally means the scattered. Jews that are scattered. They're scattered throughout the Gentile world. Now for hundreds of years, these Jews had been scattered. I'm going to give you the next chart to kind of give you an idea about the Jews in New Testament times. We think about the Jews all living in Palestine, don't we? Right? All living in the land of Canaan. Now that was a land that God gave them. But for several hundred years before Christ, these Jews, under certain circumstances, were scattered. And they were scattered during the time of Jesus Christ. And they were scattered throughout the whole world. Just to give you an illustration, and again, don't try to remember this. It's the same as I told you a little while ago, that here it is. You can see how far they were scattered in there. First of all, up there, by the first century, the Jews were dispersed to every country under heaven. Remember Acts 2? When the people came in and Peter started preaching, and who did he preach to? And here it is, every country under heaven. And now, all these were Jews, weren't they? See, they'd come in for the Passover, and so you can tell they were dispersed. Now, way back as far as 721 BC, God had taken the Jewish nation into Assyria, and many of those Jews stayed in Assyria. Then in 606 BC, God took the Jews in captivity in Babylon. He released them. Most of the Jews came back, but some of those Jews stayed in Babylon. So now we got Jews dispersed up there. The Romans carried away many slaves in 63 AD. Many of these were freed, and they became known as freedmen. The Jews captured slaves. They would capture Jews, and they would sell them as slaves. Now, Jews do not make good slaves because the Jews felt, we're the people of God, and you are sending us down, especially to Egypt, and selling them to the Egyptians. And the Jews, history tells us, caused so much trouble that many of the Egyptians freed them. And it was such a big group that finally they became known as the freedmen. And you'll read about them in Acts the 7th chapter. A certain kind of people, see, that is there. Now, many Jews had freely gone to Egypt because they feared King Nebuchadnezzar. So they ran down there. Alexander the Great, he swept through the whole nation, the whole world. And as he did, he spread Jews out. He captured them, he scattered them. The king of Assyria one time transplanted 2,000 families into those three countries. Strabo says, it's hard to find a spot in the world that is not occupied and dominated by Jews, which tells you about how wide the Jews were spread in there. So many of these Jews wanted to retain much of their Jewish culture. So they didn't want to become Gentiles. They wanted to remain faithful Jews, but they wanted to be faithful Christians. And so these are the people Paul's writing to. People that are out there in a Gentile world. They want to live in the Gentile world, but they don't want to be like Gentiles. They want to be Jews, but more than Jews, they want to be Christians. So how do I live? So you begin to see these are the people that James is writing to, that is in here. Now, as you look at that dispersion, here's an interesting note I want us to see. Those Jews were scattered, but this dispersion eventually contributed to the great success of the spreading of the gospel in the first century. So you think, well, those poor Jews, well, as you start looking at it, and you start looking at it from God's viewpoint, and here it is, he had these cultures and all this to happen. But by Acts 2, here it is that you have in Jerusalem, all the Jews under heavens came together in Jerusalem. Now, when they were in Jerusalem, many of them were converted. What would they have done after their conversion? Now, see, many of them stayed there, and history shows us they stayed there for about 4 years. And what they were doing was every day they were studying the apostles' doctrine. They were studying, so they become well equipped. And then it said they were scattered. They were scattered back out. And they went everywhere. In Acts 4, what does it say? And they went everywhere doing what? Preaching the word. See? Now, when Paul then went into the Gentile lands, and you follow his missionary journeys, when he would go into a heathen city, there would be a Jewish synagogue there. Not Christians, Jews. But they would have a Jewish synagogue. Where did Paul always go? Always went into the Jewish synagogue and started his preaching that was in there. So, you look at it and you say, boy, this great dispersion really had a lot to do with the success of the gospel of Christ. And then he said greetings. That's just a normal word that means happy or rejoice. Rejoice. Now, James will do this. He will use a word, and then his next thought, he will start with that word. And then he ends up, and then his next thought, he'll start with that last word. And he does that here in chapter 1. So now, as he says, and he greets them, rejoice. Now, that's going to be the topic that he's going to be talking about now here in chapter 1. So chapter 1 is going to be talking about the trials and tribulations of life. Stop. Ask yourself the question, why would he talk about that subject? Who's he writing to? What kind of life are they living? Do they have problems? See? Do they have problems? Yeah. See? And so he now is going to be dealing with this. Now, in the first 4 verses, and again, I'm just kind of going to give you a rundown. He's going to show us how we should view our trials. How do you look at trials? Then how do you get wisdom to endure trials? And then how do you view life in order to keep yourself stable? And then he says, now, in all of this, you keep one thing in mind. God never tempts you to sin, regardless of the problems you're in, regardless of what you have to go through. Don't you ever say, why did God do this to me? Why is God? I can't take it. Why does God? No, God never, he's going to tell us, tempts us to sin. Then he's going to say, now God is the giver of all good things we have in life. So he wants us to see this, these people that are in suffering and great tribulation. And then he tells them, now, in order to receive God's blessings, you have to be a worker, not just a hearer. You don't just hear the word, but you do the word. And then you're going to receive these blessings from God. So now we start out. And as he starts out there in verse 2, count it all joy, my brethren. Joy. Joy. Count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into manifold temptations. That means trials, troubles, problems. Now, just to start out real quickly, if I were to ask you, I want everybody to stand up here in just a minute, and I want you to tell me the most joyous times of your life. So you got time. So think about it. The most joyous times of your life. What are you thinking about? I know what you think about. You think, it's that time I went to Hawaii for a vacation. Or it was that time, and that's what you're thinking. How many of you are thinking about that horrible operation that you had, that you had to go through? That period of sickness, or that time that you lost all your money? How many of you say, you know, that was a... No, you don't do that. Now, it just sounds odd. But he's going to tell us now how to handle problems, and he's going to tell us why we handle problems like that. Now, what he's saying up there, he's not saying that you ought to go out and try to pursue problems. You say, okay, this Saturday, instead of us going out to Oliver's and having a big time, and having a picnic, and watching a bunch of idiots swim the river in the cold water, and just having a good time, let's all go out there and get a hammer and bust our fingers. Okay? So we're all sitting around and crying. Okay? Let's cause us some troubles. There, you just say, well, that's stupid, and it is stupid. But now, what he's telling us here is that he's going to tell us the meaning of troubles and trials and how to handle them that is in there. So it's not that they're so much fun, but down there, it's only when you understand the benefit of trials that you have any joy. That's all. As you look in Acts 4, when the apostles went out to preach, you remember that they were hauled in before the Supreme Court, and they were threatened, and they were told, don't you do this again. And they went back, and they were joyful. They were happy to suffer for the name of Jesus. They looked and saw, here's what's happening. It's not that it's fun, the troubles they had. Now, the suffering of Jesus on the cross explains this verse. In Hebrews, the 12th chapter, there it says this about Jesus. It's something that you meditate on for about 42 years. And then you say, I think I might understand a little bit of that. Takes a lot of meditation, a lot of thinking, that tells about Jesus, the shame of the cross. He endured the shame, it says. He endured it. What do you do when you endure something? You just suffer through it. He endured it because of the joy that was set before him. Now, when Jesus was on that cross, he's up there. Was he in any physical pain to start with? Oh, man. People down around there, what were they coming? They were coming around, what were they saying to him? Yelling up at him, challenging him. If you're the Christ, if you say who you are, come on down. He could come down any time. They spit in his face. They yelled at him, made fun of him. What did Jesus do? Not one time did he retaliate. Why? Why? Because of the joy he had on that cross. Because of the joy that was set before him. Jesus was looking not at the pain he was in. If you're looking at the pain he was in, and all this agony, it would just make him want to tear himself down from that cross, and he could have. But for the joy that was set before him, he was looking. This is what I have to do. I have to give my life, shed my blood for the sins of mankind. And if I can endure this shame, I'll be able to save mankind. I'll be able to have my church, the saved group of people, and they'll be able to live with me forever and ever in heaven. That's what Jesus was looking for on that cross. Looking ahead, not at just the joy, not just the pain that you had at that time. And so it enabled him to do it. I've got down there in the next one. The Christian is not to dwell on the suffering involved in trials, but to dwell on the good that will come from them. I use a root canal for an illustration. Most of us have had tooth problems. If you had a root canal, is that an enjoyable thing to go through? Do you dread going through that thing? And while you're there and he's drilling and hits a nerve and oh man, and it goes down, ain't that fun? Now, you're in there. What will enable you to endure that pain? What should you do as you're there in the chair? And you want me to continue? Yeah, go ahead. Why would anybody do that? Because of the joy that's set before you. You're looking ahead. This horrible pain is what will enable me to have a healthy mouth and live a happy life. See? So you do this when you're having a root canal. You're doing it at any time that you want to do it. And so it enables a person to look at pain and troubles in a certain way. It's not fun while you're going through them. It's okay to yell and scream when you're having that root canal. But always look ahead and look at the joy that is going to come from this particular thing. So when we go through suffering that involves pain and troubles and persecution, we will come out a changed individual. You will either be better or worse, but you won't be the same. Now, I want you to try to remember that. Even though it's not a verse of Scripture, it's just Williams' interpretation. But it's something that's true. And it will really help you in whatever troubles you're in. If you'll just remember, I'm going through these troubles. I'm going through these pains. Now, when I get through them, I'll either be a better person or a worse person. But I'll not be the same person. And whatever troubles you go through, however bad it is, if you lose a loved one in death, if you lose your finances, whatever it is, all the shame brought upon you, all the pain and the heartache that is just heaped on you, you think you'll never see another pleasant moment in your life? You may not. But it depends on you. It depends on how you look at that problem, how you go through it. Will you go through it in the right way? And if so, you're going to come out a better person. And if you don't, you can come out bitter, ugly, mean, mad at life, mad at everybody around you, cranky, fussy. Nobody likes to be around you. Nobody visits you. Your life just gets worse and worse. But here's the only thing I can promise you. When these big problems come upon you, you'll never again be the same. But the joy is, you now have an opportunity to come out a better person. See? You don't have that. So let me ask you this. That really is the only way you're going to benefit yourself. You go out to Oliver's house Saturday, and we're out there eating, and we eat, and we play games, and we laugh, and we do all of this. And you come home Saturday night, you ain't a better person. I'll tell you that. You come back and you say, boy, I'm a better person than I was this morning. No, you're not. No. You can't become a better person in that way. You become better, you develop, and we'll see why in here. By the agony and the problems and so forth that you go through, that's how you become a real better person. I'll give you an illustration of this. When I lost my wife, I absolutely lost all hope, and I knew I'd never find another second, I don't mean minute, I mean another second of happiness. Now, I don't know how many of you have lost a mate, but I know Linda has. Am I exaggerating? Or that's the way you feel. Never, ever. My life is ruined. I'd go to bed and I'd read books. And I still remember the spatial night. I was reading this book written by a woman. And I was laying there, and never again would I ever find a moment of happiness. My life was ending, and I had to live through it. And I'm reading it. And she says, now, when you get on down later, you get through this, you will come out a changed individual. And it says, and who knows, you may even be happier than what you were before. That made me so mad I could have ripped that book of her saying such a stupid thing as that. Right? And she said, you will come out changed. And who knows, may even be happier. And she said, I can tell you my experience that I look back on my life before my husband died, and I don't even like me then. That caught my attention. Well, I looked at that and I thought, well, you poor woman, you don't know what you're talking about. But I can say that now. I can honestly stand before you and I can say it. Linda's shaking her head. I look back before that. I don't think I was a bad guy, you know. You say, well, what is it you didn't like? I don't know what I didn't like. Well, I'll tell you it's not what I didn't like, it's what I didn't have. That's the key. I have so much more now, having gone through all of that trials and tribulations, so much more understanding, so much more of looking at life, so much more, that I look back on old Lowell, and I don't even like him now. See, that's there. That's what troubles, trials, tribulations can come to you. We all have them. So as you go into them, look at them in that way. And that's what the Bible is going to tell us, and it's going to teach us to do this. So he says, count. That word means deem it, reckon it, consider it, think it. That's what we're doing right now. Think about it this way. So here's what I want you to do. I want you to consider it and think about it. Count it all joy. That means nothing but joy. Try to look at it and say, what I'm going through now is a life-changing event. It's something that will make me a better person. Think of Job. Never a man has had to suffer like Job suffered. How did his life end up? Twice as good as what it was. Right? Twice as good. So look at suffering in that way and think about it, that it's suffering and troubles that will cause us to have all of these things. So look at that end result. So I said, count it all joy, my brethren. That word means you're born of the same parent. James uses it 15 times in these 5 chapters. How does he feel about the people he's writing to? We're on an equal. We're brothers. We have a common father. God is our father. Very humble man. And then he says, count it all joy, my brethren, when you fall into, when you fall into manifold temptations. Fall into, that's an interesting word. And it's something to think a little bit about. When you fall into. Now that means it's a trial that happens outside of man. It's not a problem that you brought on yourself. See? It's something that you couldn't see, you couldn't skirt around. That something happened, and wow, here I am in this. It's unforeseen trials that we can't prepare ourselves for. It's not something that I go out and do a bunch of stupid stuff and get myself in problems and end up broke and in jail and sitting there and, man, look at what I fell into. What would you say when you visit me in jail? I said, just look what I fell into. No, that's the hole you dug. You see, that's what you'd tell me. And so things happen to you, happens to all of us. Diseases, death, loss of finances, all of this. If they don't get the finances straightened out there, they're having another meeting tonight, and I'm not smart enough to know about all that kind of stuff that's up there. But they say if we don't do it, our economy is going to collapse. Your 401ks are going to be gone. Got to get it going. What did you do to cause that? You didn't do anything. A bunch of guys up there, greedy people, they did that. So you get up tomorrow and your wealth is gone. You got a problem you fell into. That's it. That's a whole lot different if I go out today and buy a whole bunch of stuff I can't afford and I lose everything I've got that is in there. So to fall into. Now, in Luke 10, verse 30, here's a good illustration. Do you remember the guy that was going down the road to Jericho and he fell among thieves? See? That's what it means. Here's this guy going on his own business, walking down the road, goes around a curve, bunch of thieves behind a rock, jumps out, hits him in the head, whatever they do, beat him. They left him there all beaten. The guy, did he bring it on himself? No. Just troubles that came up on him. So this is the thing here that he's talking about. Now when you fall into manifold, that word manifold means of different colors, variegated, different sorts is what it means. Now here's what it means. In Ephesians 3:10, it says there that by looking at the church, you can see the manifold wisdom of God. What would that mean? You look at my wisdom, you can see my wisdom by what I do. And you'd say, boy, Lowell has manifold wisdom. No, he doesn't have that. God has manifold. What does manifold mean? See, it's that many, variated, great, all different kinds. See, and so God has all of this. Now, how many kind of trials are there that you're going to fall into? Manifold trials. Start listing all the trials that you know that anybody has fallen into. See? Anybody had a little baby born with a crippling disease? Yeah. And so you start in, bing, and you do all of this. Now, James is going to start out, I'm going to skip that second one there. James in this book is going to be talking about the rich oppressing the poor. That would be kind of like the people up in Washington doing to us what they did to us, walking away. One guy, with $140 million, walks away, and other guy with this, and other guy with that, leaves it there. Our economy is in chaos, and do the rich still oppress the poor? On those days, they did, they see, and today they do it. He's going to talk about being dragged into court and blaspheme, where people take you to court. Anybody ever taken to court when they're not guilty and they're not, somebody just wants to get rich and make money? See? Talking about wages kept back. You do a job for a person and they don't pay you for it. Talks about killing the righteous. In other words, these are different kind of troubles that he's going to be talking about. Then he says, temptations or trials. When you fall into these manifold temptations or trials. Now, there's where we're going to stop, and I'm not going to make any comment about that. Because that's an important thing for us to see. You can look at it and a little bit, but there's where we're going to start this next week. Okay, thank you. Class dismissed.